It's almost 7 o'clock. We will start very soon. Just waiting for one or two more persons to join us. Friends, good evening. According to my laptop, it is exactly 7 o'clock. It's possible that we can have more people joining us as we commence now. But I want to begin by saying welcome. Thank you for joining in this webinar. When Communitas contacted a few of us, shared the topic that they want to do a series on, we immediately agreed and said, no, we want to participate, as this is an extremely important topic to talk about at the end of this year. I recall a couple of years ago when I was a minister in a congregation, some of us joked at the end of the year and said we want to print t-shirts for ourselves saying, sorry to hear about your problems, when we want to wear them when we do home visits. And looking back at that, I realized that was, I think, a sign of some compassion fatigue. When I studied, Professor Daniel Lowe taught us pastoral care. He often spoke about the empathetic, loving, listening position when doing pastoral care. And he often also told us that we as ministers, we must be huge sponges. In other words, just soaking up so much of the community, of the members, and all the problems. I think that's a very helpful metaphor that he shared with us. But I think some of you will also agree with me that there are many sponges at this moment that are fairly full, that's starting to drip out. So we need to talk about what is happening to us. And this is the topic for tonight. It is, we call it compassion fatigue. Others will maybe talk about empathy and a fatigue with regard to empathy. Now, this is very important because just as we as faith communities in congregations, we need to do caring, it's as important to care for the carers. So we realized it is very important for us to understand what is in a year like this, a year of a pandemic, actually a year of multiple pandemics, many things happening in South Africa and also globally on top of the pandemic, to realize what is happening. So in the planning, we have a series of 3 webinars. We start tonight, and we just want to unpack the topic and lay the foundation. We also thought some people may have some webinar fatigue at the end of this year. So instead of doing a series of 3 webinars all in a row now at the end of November, beginning of December, we want to lay the foundation tonight and roll it over to the beginning of next year. So you'll get the communication and we'll build on what's happening tonight. On the program, you are very lucky. We have 3 excellent speakers. We have, firstly, I'll introduce him properly a little bit later, Dr. Peter Van Gaalt, who will help us to understand the phenomenon of compassion fatigue a bit better. Secondly, we have Reverend Madeleine Stein. She's been doing research on preaching during the pandemic, and she will share some of her insights with us. And lastly, Dr. Peter Van Gaalt. He has done a considerable amount, he and his team, of research in this year, and he will also share his insights tonight with us. I will give the speakers an opportunity to speak to us between 10 and 15 minutes. We will then get a time for questions and answers. Joining the discussion, you can ask questions. You can post some insights. So please use the chat box. You know, the chat function on Zoom, you'll find it down there in the toolbar, And to the right of your screen, between Marijke and I, Marijke, thanks so much. She's behind the screens helping us here a lot tonight. Between Marijke and I, we will try our best to capture your questions and pose it to the speakers later on. And after the question and answer time, I'm going to ask the three speakers to, in a minute or two, just wrap it up and just tell us what, to your mind, can congregations and ministers now at this stage concerning our topic go and do. So, friends, this is what you can expect of tonight and also early next year for the rest of this specific series on compassion fatigue. So I am immediately going to start with the program, and our first speaker is Dr. Etienne Van Gaalt. He is a neurologist and CEO of Neurozone, a neuroscience and analytics company who uses a dynamic behavioral code to enhance resilience of individuals, teams, and organizations. Etienne, I trust that you are there, so please, over to you. You can open your screen and address us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cas, and good evening, everybody. Cas, can you hear me? I am here, right?
I can hear you very clearly. Thank you, Etienne.
Okay, great. It's really good to be with you. Thank you, Cas. We've got very little time, so I'm going to start right away. In fact, I'm just going to set a little stopwatch to the right here because, you know, I don't really get fatigue of talking, so I'm going to try to fit everything in this short time that we have. So when you think about compassion fatigue, one often think about a number of, let's call it fatigueness of the brain-body system. My background being in from the biological, the neurobiological, and I'm going to stick to what I know best. So I'm going to speak to you about the neurobiological and the psychoneurobiological, really, as we talk about it in Neurozone. But of course, everything that we experience has an effect on the brain-body system and vice versa. So the whole brain-body system being an holistic part of life, so critical for us to understand. And of course, it is no different when you think of fatigue. So fatigue meaning that the energy is basically running low. And of course, if you want to understand anything about fatigue, about burnout, about brain-body system implosion, one has to take into consideration one very important line, and that is energy is finite. Now, this is not the same as the sky is the limit, everything is possible. Those are very different kind of motivational and also very true for the way that we look at life and how we actually look at optimism and so forth. But it's not the same for the brain-body system and for energy. Energy is a finite entity. It means that you and I actually breathe in oxygen and we eat fuel. We basically eat very much like, you know, if you burn a piece of wood, you'll have ash at the end, but you burn it with oxygen. And in the same way, you and I actually ingest our fuel. We ingest the food that we take in that is absorbed into the whole brain-body system. It is transported to all the different cells in the body after it's been broken down to very, very small finite particles. And those substances really are then burned up by the oxygen that is inhaled into the system through the lungs. And of course, that oxygen is carried by the hemoglobin. You might remember a bit of the biology now. Maybe you have taught for a second or third or a fourth round your children about it. So hemoglobin binds the oxygen, takes it into the cells, and burns up those substances, the fuel. And then, of course, from that, you have warmth. We have a 37 degree or 36.8 degree body. We have energy that is supplied to the whole system in the form of something called ATP. And that is not a tennis tournament, right? It's called adenotriphosphate. And it actually is a finite entity that the whole brain-body system uses to do all the work that needs to be done, including thinking, including feeling, including interacting, relational aspects. I'm talking about the more higher functions of the brain, problem solving, the brain uses that finite energy to do marvelous things for us. And so we have while the brain, it constitutes about 2% of the body mass, it uses about 20% of its energy. It's a very greedy organ. And this is a very good way, I think, to start to just contextualize this incredible brain-body system for us. Because energy is finite, that's why we have leadership. That's why we have self-leadership, to allocate the resources properly so that we can actually have the highest yield for the energy that is assigned to the tasks. That's also why we work together. We aggregate into groups, because we reduce the energy that is available for much higher energy yield, or for the yield, of course, that the energy is assigned to. In the same way, the whole brain-body system needs to overcome challenges continuously. And the challenges that we have to overcome, of course, is done through something called allostasis. It's simply called complex adaptiveness. It's simply called resilience. Resilience is the capacity for overcoming all the challenges that come our way, and learning from that to grow through that, so we can actually overcome even bigger challenges of even dissimilar nature, if it is of a psychological nature. And this is why, if you think about context, it is so important the context to understand compassion fatigue and burnout, etc. From energy finite, we have to overcome the challenges that come our way with the energy that we assign to the tasks. And of course, that resilience has to be high enough so we are not overcome by the challenge, but that we overcome the challenge itself. That is at the essence of complex survival. Now I'm going to share a screen with you. And I want to speak to you about this idea of compassion fatigue by just pointing out a few things. And let me see if I can actually get there fairly quickly. I think this is the one I want to get rid of. I think I've stopped sharing again. Let me share again. Am I sharing my busy screen now? Can everybody see my screen?
It's still blank. It's just shows a white screen.
It's probably going to take a bit of time to show itself. Still a white screen?
Yes.
Your screen sharing has been paused. Let me just see if I play this here. Wonder how I can actually start this. I've never seen this. Screen sharing has been paused. Let me see if I can press play. I'll stop sharing and I'll share again. Let me see if it happens the second time around. Is that better?
I can see your cursor.
You're sharing a screen. There's something green coming in now. I think we can see it now. Can everybody see?
I can't. I only see a stripe. Marilyn, your side?
Marilyn, are you seeing the screen?
Just the stripe.
Okay. For some reason, it says I'm sharing, but I'm not sharing. I'm going to try one more, and then I'm going to fire away without the screen. And now?
Still just white.
Still just white. Okay. Then we go without it. We'll stop sharing. So what is compassion fatigue? Compassion fatigue is, it's important to understand that compassion fatigue is not the same as burnout. Compassion fatigue is a very specific condition that it occurs as a so-called secondary traumatization. It is a form of traumatization of the brain that is overcome because of the way that it actually applies itself in terms of its empathy and compassion. And of course, it speaks to compassion, meaning that I feel in your shoes, but I am compelled to help you out of your condition to do something, to actually assign energy to the task, to support you to overcome the challenge. And that specific kind of energy transfer, remember energy is finite, can actually become completely depleted. And it's because of the secondary traumatization that compassion fatigue occurs. Compassion fatigue leads to a very specific form of what we call brain-body system implosion. It does not lead to burnout. Why is that? So what is burnout then? So burnout is a very specific, called medical syndrome. Important to understand that this medical syndrome has been defined by the World Health Organization as a medical syndrome, specifically in the presence of chronic stress in the workplace. So if you think about COVID, we are coming through a very, very tough time, and we are actually probably halfway. We don't even know exactly where we are. But we are in the midst of a severe global crisis. We have had to make major adaptations, and we are most likely to experience a form of chronic stress due to the stressors in the workplace, which has now become very real. And of course, we have moved out of very much a lockdown where everybody's in it together into a space where we are now being fragmented into smaller and yet smaller sections of groups who now have to, and even individuals who become fairly disconnected again. And so we see that this leads to chronic stress being increased in the workplace, and that can lead to burnout. So compassion fatigue and burnout being two different conditions, all leading to what we call brain-body system implosion. Both of these effectively challenging the resilience of the system, which if it is, once it is being overburdened, the whole system implodes. And it leads to severe pro-inflammation, which can be very asymptomatic. And you can even just have the symptoms of anxiety, feeling very disconnected, depression, and feeling overcome by even the smallest cue that would not have been the case had that not being around. So the idea of brain-body system implosion is important to understand. The pro-inflammation that comes from that and actually stems as a result of this process can be very detrimental for the brain-body system. And it means that the immune system becomes activates the whole brain-body system, and it starts to actually wreak havoc, especially in the parts of the body which are more genetically susceptible for disease. For example, if I have a cardiovascular propensity, I have genetic cracks in my cardiovascular system, then I might develop the cardiovascular conditions that will lead to a myocardial infarct, or a heart attack, or strokes. So I can have this vascular disease, and we think it is cholesterol and what we eat. Those are all multifactorially important. But underneath, the underlying condition is, in this particular case, an inflammation of the vascular system, which leads to the whole process being accelerated. And so I get those conditions way, way sooner than I was supposed to develop them, probably well beyond my 80s when it is time to go home. And so now I have a much more detrimental condition, maybe in my 50s or 40s, where this now starts to actually become accelerated. This is a result of brain-body system implosion, chronic stress in the workplace, burnout, and of course compassion fatigue. Fortunately, can be turned around and reversed as can burnout. But you can see how all these things now start to become stacked together, and the cumulative process is what is so concerning in this time that we are living in. I think that's probably everything I can say in this particular time slot. If there is a bit of time and I can get my screen going, I can show you what the data has shown in terms of the predictors for resilience and what we should be doing to actually build the resilience to prevent this whole implosion from actually happening to us as individuals and as groups at Neurozone. The study that has been done and looked at leaders globally. But Gus, maybe I can share that a bit later, but I think that is what I can say now.
Etienne, perfect. This is very helpful to get us going for the evening. Somebody in the chat box said that maybe the screen sharing has to do with whiteboard. So maybe you can look at that. I'm not quite sure that difference, the technical aspect, but more than welcome to later come back then and share your screen if that works. Thank you very much, Etienne. We will immediately go and over to Marilyn. I just want to introduce Marilyn. I don't have to look at the paper to introduce Marilyn. She has got 2 master's degrees. The first one, she specialized in homiletics, that's preaching. The second one in worship, in liturgy. She's busy with a PhD. She's a youth pastor at Saldanha Dutch Reformed Church. And why she is especially here tonight is since lockdown at the end of March, she started with research on preaching during the pandemic. And we thought that the insights that Marilyn has gained can help us a lot right at the beginning also of this webinar series. So Marilyn, we're looking forward to listening to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gus. Appreciate it. Okay, so also moving very swiftly to get through everything. Basically, what I did the past few months was to look at the sermons preached in 12 Dutch Reformed Church congregations. We looked at the sermons at the end of March, the 2 weeks at the end of March, just before lockdown, just after lockdown, the 2 last weeks in May, 2 months later, and then again 2 months later, the last 2 weeks in July. The reason I did this was there is this book, The Plague by Albert Camus, and in the book, Father Panelu preaches 2 sermons, at the beginning of the plague and at the end of the plague. And the 2 sermons differ vastly. The tone is different, his language is different, the theology he uses is different. And the question we asked was, would the sermons in our own context also develop and progress in a certain manner as the pandemic progressed? And that's why we looked at the sermons preached in March, May, and July. So just quickly how we did it is we used grounded theory. So we looked at sermons that people made available to us and also some sermons that were available online. And just 2 sentences about grounded theory. It is an inductive research approach, meaning you start in the data and you move up to a theory, an emerging theory. You don't test a theory. And the idea is that you code, you categorize the codes, and then you get a core category around which all the other categories center. And that forms your emerging theory. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the emerging theory. So for March, May, and July, we had an emerging theory of what everybody preached. And I'm not going to spend too much time on the detail thereof. If you are interested, you are welcome to contact me. But what I want to talk about today is that we saw 3 facets in preaching each time in all 3 months. There's the experienced reality of the listener. There is the proclaimed reality that the preacher preaches. And then there is the call to action. And I would just like to make a few comments on how they progress throughout the 4 months overall. So the experienced reality in the beginning, at the end of March, was the theodicy question regarding where is God in all this confusion and disruption. It was disruption regarding the fact that we can't gather as, in our churches as usual, the disruption of social distancing and lockdown. And then there was talk of the fear of corona. Now, what I find very interesting, and I don't know whether this counts as burnout or compassion fatigue or signs of it, but as the months progressed, the experienced reality that the preachers addressed complicated or was more complex. So where they spoke about fear in the beginning, they started talking about being depressed and being anxious and being feeling out of control. So it kind of deepened. The theodicy question came and went as everything progressed. It wasn't so constant. And then the other thing is the disruption that people, that the preachers addressed was not only corona. As the months progressed, so they came to speak more and more about lockdown. So in the beginning, if I can use that language, in the beginning, corona itself was the main enemy. But as time progressed, lockdown itself also became an enemy. linking it with the depression and everything else. So that was the experienced reality and how that progressed. Then there was the proclaimed reality, which I would like to pause, but that's the answer to the experienced reality. And then the call to action also moved as the months continued. So in the beginning, people said mostly that it's necessary to have habits of faith and discernment. Habits of faith being lament, silence and seclusion, rituals, and serviceability. If I listen to Etienne, that serviceability is a call to action. I can see what's happening around me and I'm bound to react to it. It's a form of compassion also, I believe. And so that stood central to what the ministers preached. They said, this is your experienced reality, but if you want to experience the proclaimed reality of who God is, then you have to engage in habits of faith and discernment. And as the months progressed, it became a little more passive, if I can almost say that. So it's in the May sermons, it's to surrender and trust. It's kind of this giving over, surrendering idea that came forth very strongly. And then in July, it was again habits of faith, but the habits of faith included being praising, thankfulness, mentoring. And then the action that was also called upon was to repent, take part in the kingdom, a bit more active again, and to care for one another. Again, joining up with serviceability that we had in the beginning. What interested us the most was the proclaimed reality. And that was what we labeled at first as God's godliness and God's divinity. So what we said is, in the beginning, people preached and talked about God in a certain way. And the language they used was, God is in control. God has the authority over death. His love is stronger than death. God continues to create. God is present. God is near. And the interesting thing is that remained the same throughout the 4 months. Throughout March, May, July, that message did not change, despite the fact that the other factors and facets changed. And so the interesting thing for us was not so much what changed, but what remained constant. Because if it can remain the same, the theology, even though everything else changed, it means it's a very deep lying theology. And so we looked at the work of Prof. Daniel Lowe, and he identifies 6 different metaphorical languages or traditions that people use to speak about God. And one of those is the monarchical tradition, the kingship language. And basically, we went back, we looked at all the sermons, proclamations about God, and most of them fell into this tradition of speaking about God as the king. Now, I want to pause there for a moment. The research originally only focused on the end of March. And by that time, we said that maybe the liturgical day, or let me just say the end of March was Easter. And we said that the liturgical day of Silent Saturday may help us to reflect on preaching. Because Silent Saturday, silent referring to a habit of faith, silent also being one of the habits of faith that came forth. And so it's a day that helps us to remember that we can hold on to both Good Friday and the pain and the suffering involved therein, and the hope and the joy of Resurrection Sunday, and to sit in the middle of those 2 days. And we refer to it as a day of liminality. Liminality meaning to be in between. So in between this pain and hope, suffering and hope. And so because we used Silent Saturday originally, we went and we said, okay, if they say God is the king, then what language can help us? What liturgical day can help us when speaking about God is the king? Now, yesterday was Sunday, the day of Christ our King. So this is excellently timed. Thank you, Gus. And basically what we said is that the day of Christ our King is a day of expectation. It's the end of the church year. Just a quick remark there. It's interesting just to notice in this time again that the church here and the world here is a bit off key, out of rhythm, if you can say that. And I'll return to that comment a bit later. But the idea is to say that it's a day of expectation, because it's not only about saying that God is the king, this affirmation, but it's also an anticipation of God, the coming King. And so this really played a strong role. And we talked about the way that ministers can really use this to preach, to say, but we affirm what is, but there is also a lot is not. If you can, yeah. And the other thing about a king is that there's a kingdom, and the kingdom of God is, to our understanding, central to the gospel of Christ. And to say that Christ is a king is to say that Christ is anti-empire. He's anti the empire of the Roman Empire. He's anti-empire of corona and death. He's anti the empire of gender-based violence that we know so much about this year, especially. He's anti the empire of corruption. He's anti the empire of racism. And so while we're talking about COVID in this time, really, there are so many things asking for our attention that the topic of compassion fatigue is not only because we have corona, it's because there are so many other things, so many other empires asking for our attention and our compassion and our action. And so in the end, we said that to preach about Christ the King is to say and affirm, but Christ is the King, but also to move towards provocation and to become angry and to say, but there are some things and some areas where Christ is not the King. He's not the King where corruption reigns, for instance. But he is the King over all because we anticipate it. And so I think in terms of compassion fatigue, I personally think that it's a way to hold on to what is not and still find a way forward. Because really, my understanding, which is very limited, I'm not a neuroscientist, of compassion fatigue is this feeling of what I cannot do. But there is an affirmation of what can be. There is a provocation of what I can challenge, how minor it may be. And so that is more or less what we talked about. And if you have any other questions, I would be glad to answer them.
Marilyn, thanks so much. I think it connects so well with what Etienne gave us. He helped us to understand the situation better. And I think what you're telling us is taking a step closer to but there is hope. Something can be said and can be done as well. So thanks so much for that. We move straight on to our third speaker, and that is Dr. Peter Van Gaalt, who is a minister specially tasked with coordinating the research network of the Dutch Reformed Church in the Western Cape. And he's also coordinating the Kerkspiel, the Church Mirror research. So I think this can be fascinating, the work that you've done, Peter. Please, over to you.
Thank you, Gus. Thanks, Etienne and Marilyn. It was so nice to listen to you. Etienne, I received your slides, so maybe towards the end I can also share your slides if you want to speak a bit towards that. I looked at them and I think it will fit in very nice when I've shared a few of my slides. Yes, in such a short time, it's difficult to give a coherent picture of all the research that we have done during this time. But I'm going to try to show some snapshots or some screenshots, and I hope that you will find some coherence in them. First of all, I was talking to Etienne over the weekend. He's my brother, and we always try to joke with each other over the weekends. And he said to me, you know, you can only have compassion fatigue if you have compassion. So I thought this is maybe a nice way to start. I don't know if you can see my screen now, Gus. I'm going to try to share it.
Not yet.
There it is.
Coming. Yes.
Okay, so the first one is that I think there will be a lot of compassion fatigue in our system, in the churches, because people are really compassionate. And maybe that sounds obvious, but I don't know if it is. It was quite a surprise. During the 10th week of the lockdown, we asked members of our church about their needs during this time. And what was very striking was that they rated the need for somebody to help them make sense of what's happening very low in comparison with the opportunity to help people. So the difference between those two was very big. You know, it was a very, not that it's unimportant, but they said, we do not need somebody now to help me make sense of what's happening, to understand what's going on, to ask, to clarify questions about God and so forth. But we want the opportunity to help people who are in need and distress. So that was a very prominent thing during the feedback. And then the second thing, the most dominant thing, trend that came back from congregations during this time was that congregations in general joined networks in their communities to help people who were suffering and who were in distress. So I think the consciousness of people around us that are suffering tremendously, it was really a deep consciousness, and then also this thing of congregations joining networks to help people in need. The second slide just shows that, pastors, a very high percentage said, I found meaning, personal meaning during this time by helping in my community. And almost all congregations involved with some kind of community project. I think 72% in the Western Cape involved in food distribution of some kind. So that is just the first snapshot that I want to show, is that there is a lot of compassion in our system. We had a lot of discussion about what kind of thing is this? Is it only charity or what is it? But the point is that there is a lot of compassion. The second thing, just about the personal spirituality, personal faith side, is in week 10, our pastors in a general pastors panel said that in week 10 they could have, they experienced a fulfilled life, that their work provides meaning for them, that they could do exercise and so on. This was it was actually more than 80% of respondents said this. And last week, we tested this again, and we also asked an open question, and still need to sit a bit more with the data, but it is very prominent that that pastors said that we could take care of ourselves during this time. We developed new disciplines. We very intentionally spent time, quiet time before God and with ourselves and so on, to stay healthy. So that is also, I think, amidst the challenges, this is something very positive. Then just this snapshot, the awareness of economic inequalities in our society, and the awareness of, let's call it, historic privileges. In our community, in the Dutch Reformed community, this came out very strong, which also accentuates the time of emotional stress that people are going through during this time, and combine this with the compassion, and think of compassion fatigue. This also, I think, enhances something like compassion fatigue. Let me give some hopeful news, is that amidst the distress, the hope that Marlene spoke of, we asked congregations, do you have mechanisms for survival post-COVID? And I didn't know what to expect, but 90% said yes. And what was really surprising was the mechanisms that they mentioned. This was an open question, and this is what came out top and in frequential order. I hope that's the right name for it. But in any case, the most people said we have adaptability. We can think differently about church. We can think differently about structures in our church and in churches in our towns. We can innovate. We have competent leaders, not only pastors. Members are dedicated. We have a strong sense of calling. And then at number 5, the income comes in, trusting the Lord. Members take actions, they take initiative. The digital ministry is helping us, and where there's a will, there's a way. So the kind of mechanisms all has to do with tenacity, and most of them has to do with tenacity, adaptability, about the things that I think Etienne is also speaking about. We asked people, what will the role of pastors be in 2 or 3 years' time? We asked a lot of congregational leaders through surveys, and interesting, 2 and 4 would have come out number 1 and 2 for a very long time, preaching and pastoral care. But now it was overtaken by the ability to guide people to cross boundaries in our broader community. And pastoral care was overtaken by mentorship, spiritual guidance, and so forth. So this is also interesting when thinking about something like compassion fatigue. How will this maybe help us? And what type of pastors do we need to form? And what kind of leadership do we need to cultivate for the future? What did we learn in COVID? The capacities that they will need, we asked about that, apart from the digital skills, which is quite obvious during this time. The clusters came out, missional capacities and flexibility and creativity. And flexibility, things like adaptability, teachability, innovation, and missionality, ability to build networks or even to join networks, to build healthy relationships in the community, to cross cultural and language boundaries, and to share the good news of the gospel. So the last snapshot, we asked people last week, congregational leaders, with which things that you were busy pre-COVID will you stop after COVID? And this, it had to do with busyness. We had a deepening of our faith. We had deeper discernment of what is it really about. And we will not have meetings that do not matter. And we will even not be too busy on Sundays. So those things, early indicators, we will still have a look into the data further, but these are early indicators. Thank you, Cas.
Peter, thanks so much. This is helpful. This is insightful. I must admit now I have a question or two, but I have to hold on. I think we now give Etienne, before we go into our question and answer time, Etienne, is that good with you? You still want to share a slide or two and talk on it? Am I right?
I think I need 3 minutes. I think that's about it, and then we will be fine. Thank you, Gus.
Perfect. Go for it.
Peter, let me just see if I can share this. Oh, you're sharing. Oh, good. Peter, you can go. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I have to just first say that this is a real disclaimer, and of course, I have to speak the truth. So the truth is that Peter and I did not actually share this information with each other. We had a broad conversation about this, but I didn't see the details of what he had shown of what became important, what was important initially, what was the important characteristics, if you may, things that became important for in his survey during this time in COVID. What we've done, of course, now we live in a much Neurozone is a scientific, let's call it secular. I don't believe there's something secular, but let me just say it is. We work in a scientific world where we ask questions that is got to do with well-being, has to do with high performance readiness for organizations, people, teams, and so on. And so what we do is we use a set of, currently from this particular assessment group analytics, we use 65 different behaviors emotional states and cognitive states that are being assessed. And what you see here, I see everything is number 1, but this is actually 1 to 7, 2, 4, 6, 7. My apologies, but you'll see that that's actually 1 to 7. You can, and those are the top 7 pre-COVID predictors of resilience. Now, just to be sure that this is a stable, what we call code. These are the top 7 and has been the top 7 over a number of 3 years pre-COVID. When you look at about 10,500 leaders in organizations, more or less in South Africa, Australia, the US, and a few in Europe. So, and it's been very stable. Optimism, number 1, of course, optimism meaning that you believe that this too shall pass. You think about hope, critical, this too shall pass, and we will not pass with it, or we will overcome this challenge, and the challenge will not overcome us. This is the kind of optimism we talk about, not about the Pollyanna syndrome of everything is pretty and beautiful. That's something else. And of course, then there's reducing negative thought patterns, which can be seen as a destructive habit, but a very specific destructive habit. But reducing negative thoughts in groups, in aggregates, being very effective. The generic parts technique is a technique that one uses to solve problems. You break a problem up into its most generic parts, and then you allow your brain to unconsciously assemble these parts into a solution. It's meaning in work life speaks for itself, the sense of having a meaning in work life. I think Peter spoke to that as well. By the way, the optimism and hope, that's once again, I took that, it's very inspirational from Leon's 10 minutes. And then reducing fear and greed, the whole idea of reducing your fear and greed complex. We all have this. I don't need to say more about that. Of course, intermittent fasting is a new kid in the block, hugely important for reducing inflammation right through the whole brain-body system. And then if you really want to sleep well, you want to sleep between that 7 to 9 hours for about 99% of the population. That is good and right, 7 to 9 hours. You need one thing, and that is bedtime consistency. So going to bed at the same time every night, and the whole circadian day-night rhythm sorts itself out. That was pre-COVID. Predictive resilience means that if you practice one piece, one unit of optimism, and one unit of bedtime consistency, you'll get way more out of the optimism than out of the bedtime consistency. And so you can see this is really important in terms of the weightedness and its contribution to enhance resilience. Our resilience system is well established and being validated. And remember that resilience referred to a number of things. And I need to actually now just latch onto what Peter said when he spoke about this idea of innovation, creativity, and learning and adaptiveness and flexibility. So resilience is all of that. Resilience is the capacity to overcome challenges through problem solving, which is very often mostly unconscious, but also conscious, through problem solving, and then learning from that and growing through those experiences, as we said, to become more and more capable of adapting even further. And so, and remember that creativity, the neuroscientific definition of creativity is to solve problems and to fashion novel products that are adaptive for the group. Now I'm going to show you quickly what's happened since COVID. This is actually quite incredible. What you see to the far right here are the 7 top predictors during the COVID pandemic. And if you look at this slide to the left, you'll see that 25 Feb, 28 April, 25 May, and 21 July, we've been looking at all the data of those leaders who are on the system. And it is statistically significant. These results have been well analyzed. And you can see that all of a sudden, exercise diversity is the number 1 predictor, exercise duration number 2, destructive habit avoidance number 3, reducing negative thought patterns is still in there, number 4. And then you have enthusiasm as new as is all the top 3. Enthusiasm also speaks to hope and physical mobility, interesting enough, also coming in at number 6, and then optimism dropping from 1 to 6. Remember that it's still from 1 to 7. Remember that these are still the top 7 out of 65, so they are greatly important. But it's quite fascinating how you've seen a whole shift in the population, if you may, of what is now the predictors. What are the most important predictors now of resilience during a whole new ecosystem external factor called COVID? Of those 7, you have to note that there are 4 very important new kids and also old ones. Destructive habit avoidance, reducing negative thought patterns, enthusiasm, and optimism are all we know now in the brain. They are the behaviors and emotional states that actually drives the whole high performance energy system, the system that provides energy to assign to tasks to overcome challenges. It's called the goal-directed system, goal-directedness, and it works in a very particular part of the brain, and I wish I had time to show that to you. But let me show you how those have changed over the period of COVID. So just the final one, Peter, we're going to stop at this slide. But here you can see how the different types of behaviors have actually changed during COVID. These are the 5 months in COVID. You can see it to the right there, and even the 20th of August also added. But look what goal-directedness have done over this period of time. It's become increasingly more important as a predictor of building your resilience to overcome the challenges, not to implode, despite compassion fatigue and despite burnout threats. This seems to be the one that's actually really growing quite significantly. The so-called goal-directedness, I'm repeating them again, the enthusiasm, the reducing of negative thought patterns, the avoiding of destructive habits, and then finally, optimism, of course, which speaks so much to hope. Yeah, I hope that this all actually links so nicely with what Marlene and Peter said as well. That's it, Peter.
Absolutely, it does, Etienne. Thanks. Can actually be extremely interesting. We've got a real interdisciplinary panel going here, and to see how neuroscience can be a strong variable in homiletics and vice versa, and everything connects in the end. It is absolutely great. I'm keeping my eye on the chat there and waiting for some questions. So all the participants, anybody, you're welcome. I've been told that we don't have the possibility for participants to post their questions with audio, so you need to type there in the right hand in the chat. It will be wonderful if you can do that. In the meantime, some of the speakers may have questions to some of the other speakers. You're also welcome to do that. Something I want to mention when you were speaking now, Etienne, I was thinking last year I had the privilege to attend a conference in Berlin, and there's a South African living there because his wife got a job there, and she's doing a very difficult job, and she got the job because they say the Germans aren't good with it, and that is to problem solve and to handle uncomfortable and challenging situations that happens very quickly. And for me, that was quite interesting to hear that we are South Africans. And I was wondering whether we, because we've got that ability, according to them, are doing differently or better during COVID than maybe some other nations. I know it will be a harsh generalization, but I was thinking of that.
I think it will be even harsher if I agree with you, so I've got to be very careful, Gus. But I really want to agree with you. Maybe just two points. One is we being in a frontier world where we have to overcome major challenges. I don't think anybody have to remind ourselves of the multitude of challenges that we have to overcome in South Africa as South Africans, and that we are challenged with. So one could argue that we have to build very strong resilience to overcome the challenges. I would argue that if you then go to another world part where you still can adapt and have the social safety and belonging, and that, which is so critical, you'll probably do very well. But the challenge is that that's often not the case, that social safety is a challenge, that there are other challenges that start to erode the resilience capacity of our brain-body systems when we are outside of the space of the safety that we are longing for. The challenge in South Africa, of course, is that the challenges might be so harsh, and they often are, that it overcomes our resilience, even though we are such a resilient nation. So I am of the opinion that, by the way, I just have to say one more thing. There was a wonderful study done by, I think it's MIT, who looked at the diversity. In fact, it's a center of collective intelligence, who looked at what is the right kind of ingredients of a diverse group to enhance this collective creative capacity, which of course is critical for enhancing your capacity for problem solving. And it was shown that the diversity we have in South Africa, provided that you have that diversity in your teams, is of an ideal size, which is another very interesting point. So I'm actually supporting you, I hope, in a variety of ways.
Thank you. Maybe one of the panelists, Peter or Marilyn, observations, something that you've thought of whilst some of the others were speaking. You're welcome.
If I may, Marilyn, if I may ask you, during the work that you did in the early stages of COVID preaching, we also studied your report, and it was so interesting to see that people in the Dutch Reformed Church, they want to be of service. I mean, that's a very key concept in their imagination, is we have to serve our communities. We have to be like the servant, Jesus Christ, and so forth. And the question was asked, when we talk about being of service, are we talking enough about justice in our communities when we serve and we help others? Do we engage? Do we really engage with people on a level where it makes a real difference, where a real reconciliation, for instance, can take place, and so forth? So that was the whole debate opened up, and we think that we saw in the young pastors panel last year, pastors in our church younger than 40, that they have more of a sense of the systemic issues, and actually the need for them is to engage with systemic issues in their towns and communities. But the congregations want them to do barmhartigheid in the congregation. So that was the whole discussion. And maybe in the next round, how did you compare some aspects of that, or can you just maybe comment on that?
Yes, Peter, you're taking me back a few months now. Yes, that was something interesting that we noticed, that people want to engage in, can we say, anti-empire behavior, if you can put it that way. But that sometimes people feel more stuck in the charity work. I think that what's interesting, in July, they said that one of the things that we should do is, when we notice God's godliness, we should take part in the kingdom. And I think that is also, that's take care of others, which is more emotional to my mind. I mean, I'm not the preacher. I don't know whether that's exactly what they meant. But to say to take part in the kingdom, I think that's definitely some of the more provocative issues, and the what's the word you used? But the more, the about equality and justice and those kind of things. In the beginning, in March, we weren't sure exactly what people meant. It was more about remaining in contact, helping each other with charitable things. But I think later on it did become a little bit stronger. We thought initially that the themes of anti-empires that we mentioned earlier, gender-based violence, corruption, and so forth, racism, that the language in that line will come out stronger. And we were surprised that it didn't. But yeah, I think it's definitely something that people talk about a lot off the pulpit. We just need to see how people talk about it on the pulpit.
It will be interesting to monitor it, in the next year or so, to see what shifts happened, because there are some indications that there was this immediate need in the community and the stress, and people got involved just to help people not to die from hunger. And in the process, new relationships was formed in the community, and there's positive spin-offs. It will remain to be seen how sustainable it was, but we hope and pray, and we can play into that.
Thanks so much. There are some questions coming in now. I just want to add to the conversation you just had that, for example, there's a young theologian from Bloemfontein. He just completed his PhD on post-colonial homiletics. And it's going to really open up a conversation exactly in line with what you're talking about here, which is very necessary. I'm going to pose a question here that we received from Peter Tief. Thank you to all the panelists for your input. My question is directed towards Marilyn and or Peter. And his question is, how did the changing theology and missional awareness you spoke about translate into liturgy, both in the world and in the physical electronic services? I think you can also read the question there. I think it's a very, very interesting question that he's posing. So any one of you, if you want to respond to that. Did you? Yeah. Yes,
yes.
Marilyn.
Well, immediately the question makes me regret the fact that I did not look at the liturgy and looked more at the sermons themselves, though it would be very interesting to see how the liturgy has changed. From what I did notice, I think the way ministers talk at the moment about continuing with electronic services is an interesting missional point. I know missional is not only spreading the word, but it's about reaching the outsider. And I think that the fact that we went over to the digital services made a lot of congregations more aware of the outsiders, saying, but we didn't know those people, wanted to have access to the sermons, and we're reaching all these people we didn't before. And so I think that's many ministers I speak to said that they want to continue those digital services, not so sermons. And part of it is to continue to include the outsider, the parent who's home alone, the wife whose husband is overseas and she doesn't want to come to the service by herself, the older person who doesn't have the capacity to come into the church, probably for various reasons. So I cannot speak for all liturgy. I think it's interesting what our use of the Eucharist say also about our missional awareness, because it's more inclusive lately in some spaces. But for me, it's interesting to see that we're very much more aware of the outsider lately.
Yes, thank you, Marilyn. And I personally think a lot we will still see in the near future, because the online liturgies, they've also, of course, got great ecclesiological implications, some positive, some less positive, and we must also keep the shadowy side in mind. Peter, would you like to add?
Thanks, Pete. It's a great question. I think some things come to mind. Some congregations created platforms for people to just share their COVID stories and their, the Grendeltyd stories, to just share it with each other. And that also, I think, helped with the resilience in the community and also personal resilience. Because when you feel isolated, as I understand Etienne is explaining about the brain-body system, once you become isolated and you feel isolated, the resilience drops. So I think congregations can do a fantastic job to get people to share their stories with each other. The other day I heard about a congregation who had a ons onthou diens, we remember service, where they had a big service where people who experienced loss of family and loved ones during the COVID time, that they could all come together and celebrate the lives of those people. So that's the power, I think, that you have in a congregation, and I think those type of things, you hear all the more stories like that. We are gathering stories like that at the moment. So I hope we can gather a lot of stories like that, and I know that Marlene is also busy gathering stories.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter and Marlene. We are getting more and more questions now. Here is a question from J.R. Nieuwenhuizen. Maybe that's Johan, I'm not sure. He's asking, how can we assist the healthcare systems with compassion fatigue? Another very important question, how can we assist the healthcare systems with compassion fatigue? Etienne, can I look in your direction for this one?
I'm going to be very quick. It's been described in literature as well that especially to professional services, if you think about, apart from, you think about the world of ministers and the church, there's also healthcare, to the point here, healthcare professionals who suffer from compassion fatigue. And the other interesting one is the legal system. It's attorneys and lawyers and so forth. And you can imagine in South Africa, once again, layered with so many challenges, that's also make it very prevalent in South Africa. But the healthcare professionals are suffering greatly when it comes to compassion fatigue at the moment. It's not only compassion fatigue, it's a number of very traumatic components. In fact, the way to deal with this is multifactorial. But what I can say is, from a resilience perspective, these are the things that they need to really work on. I can almost take my minute at the end, Cast, because we're running out of time, but the minute, really, if you really want to look after the brain-body system, you have to look after exercise as an incredibly important to build resilience. And you have to look after reducing negative thought patterns, and you really have to reduce any destructive avoiding habits, those disciplines that Peter talked about as well. This and bedtime consistency, these apply very strongly for the healthcare professionals. I worked in a hospital myself, in very busy practices and in very busy hospitals. Bedtime consistency is a big challenge. Now, these are the things that the system needs to look after very carefully if you think about healthcare professionals. And of course, then when you think about enthusiasm and optimism, this is, I think, where our dominis can play an extremely important role in church for healthcare professionals who are part of the congregations, look after them very, very specifically. Those is what I would say is what our at least what our analytics, our data shows us.
We're speaking about, to a large extent, also about spirituality tonight, connected to compassion fatigue. And Etienne, every time I hear from you, please remember, correct me if I'm wrong, that body-brain is so connected to your spirituality and all these things that you mention. I mean, don't disconnect, don't think spirituality is something different.
Yes, please. That's right. We use a term that says brain-body system because people often separate the body and the brain from each other when you think biological. When you think about our whole interconnectedness with every living being and with God, the being God, connected with God through Christ, there's a whole holistic perspective as well. And so we often say the physical, the emotional, spiritual world are all interconnected. It's a holistic perspective that we have on that. Of course, as scientists, we can only verify what we see. So that's that of course makes it a bit harder for us.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Here's a question, I think mostly posed at me, but I'm in the chair, so I can pose it at the panelists. It's from Jerome Haupt, and he's asking, my experience was that many of our younger dominis that has been called to congregations last year or even the beginning of this year were overwhelmed by the challenges caused by COVID. This is just my personal experience. Is there any possibility that theology students can be prepared better for the challenges of this magnitude if they should present them again? I might add that I'm speaking from a Uniting Reformed Church point of view. The reason I'm asking this question is that many church leaders has been overwhelmed by this pandemic, but is still expected to lead the congregations in this time. Jerome, excellent, and such an important question, I think, for all of us. From my side, I will immediately say that I think our biggest job at the faculty and what we must be doing in our teaching that hopefully will help theology students and ministers in difficult times is good, solid theology. That's it. That's the job. That's what will take us and carry us through times like these. For example, if you look at the research that Madeleine showed us, I mean, we had good, solid preaching because there was, in the past decades, good, solid homiletics at this faculty and some other places as well. But I'm going to, Peter or Madeleine, Madeleine, you've been studying since until fairly recently, maybe your opinion, and also Peter.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think, and this is something Gus and I spoke about, is to better equip students in terms of technical skills. And I know that's not the only context that you are talking about, but just to equip them saying, but how do you preach? How do you edit? How you used to have classes on how to use your body and your voice. Now we have to tell people how to use your camera and your editor. So that's definitely something in the homiletics that we will, that Gus and I already spoke about introducing more. In terms of my own experience, I've been in the ministry now for 4 years. And when I hear compassion fatigue, I don't think about theology, I think about social work. So I did a bit of social work together with my theology studies, and that's where I learned about compassion fatigue. That's where I learned about some of the ways in dealing with it, because social workers can expect it. And perhaps it's just, and your question is a small reminder that the theology faculty should also take note and introduce those topics into the curriculum of theology students as they are included in the curriculum of social work students. So yeah, I think it's a real question. I think it's even more difficult in some contexts where you are the only minister and there's not a lot of leave. You have all the leave you can take, but there's not a lot of opportunity to take the leave. And I think the church structure should look more into the fact that we support congregations to take leave, so that people have the opportunity to breathe and recuperate. I think that's also part of the problem.
Sure. Madeleine, I agree with you. More and more interdisciplinary work in, I think, all the departments will be pressed even more in the near future. Peter, would you like to add if you want to? And then I'm going to take a last question that I see there, and then we're going to start to wrap up the webinar.
Just to say, Jerome, I really feel for a pastor who had to start in the congregation this year, 2020. I think in other lines of work as well, but we are in a relationship business, and you didn't have time to get to know a lot of people in the congregation. So it was a difficult year. I can just imagine for a pastor starting during this year. And again, the point of isolation, if you feel isolated, it becomes difficult. So I think the creativity is just, what can we do to connect as good as possible? And it will become better then.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, Madeleine and I taught a group of MDiv students preaching this year, and we haven't met them in person yet. So it is not ideal, but that's also a whole huge learning curve also on our side, I must say. There's a last question posed by Dirk Stein. I've experienced a drastic gap between my own symbolic reality and many congregants around me. Congregants dispute the US elections, cast suspicions on vaccine research, and still deny the existence of COVID. I can't deal with conspiracy theories at all anymore. Please help. Sure. No, that must be very, very, very rough. Maybe some wisdom from anybody?
Oh, I would love to say something about it, if I may.
Etienne, please go for it.
Once again, just quick. I think one of the most amazing things that I've, and I live in a world of creatives. Many of my friends are creatives and artists, and it's wonderful to have these conversations around this idea of the conspiracy theories. One has to always know that the conspiracy theory, as you know, is it's the dark side of the moon. The dark side of the moon is always the dark side of the moon. You just can't get around it. The challenge with, I think the best way to deal with a conspiracy theory is to deal with it as it is. It's a theory, and it should never be ridiculed as being absolutely wrong. But it should be dealt with science. And the way you deal with science, with a conspiracy, with any theory, is by basically just saying, is this the most likely explanation for this particular phenomenon? And so if you observe a phenomenon, the question is, what is the most likely explanation for this phenomenon? And then can you verify that? So this is one of the big challenges for conspiracy theory. They realize this is, around a fire, around a braai, you'd probably be able to just say, this must be the least likely explanation, right, for this phenomenon. There's a more likely explanation. And unfortunately, it's always the more mundane one. It's less sensational. And so as I said at the end of one of the conversations with one of my very bright but artistic friends recently, when he came up with one of these theories again, said, I have bad news for you and me. The world is just not as beautifully sensational as you and I want it to be.
Wonderful, thanks. Thank you, Etienne. Friends, I promised in the beginning, I'm going to ask our three panelists a last question. And the question is, what can congregations and ministers now already at this stage do with regard to compassion fatigue? I think we're going to unpack this question in much more detail in 2021, but we at least want to give all the participants just something to take home. I think we can keep it the way we started out. So starting with Etienne, then Marlene, and then Peter. Etienne.
I think what is interesting for me, and I hope that this is accurate, is that from Marlene's conversation and Peter's survey and information, there's something here that seems that we've moved as church congregants and as dominees, if I may say so, from a period almost of where God is king and kingdom, an imperial view to and living, to a more service-oriented, do some things, look after each other and one another, which increases the risk for compassion fatigue. And therefore, I find it so fascinating that you've actually so wonderfully really initiated this series of webinars, and I take that home away from my side. Thank you very much for that incredible, interesting timeline that you both have given to me as panelists. I want to just add, maybe from my side, never forget that we are a whole being, and God has created every single part of our being. And so exercise, reducing negative thought patterns, avoiding destructive habits, practicing enthusiasm, practicing optimism, just sounds like the Psalms, right? And I suppose many other parts of the Bible, is critical, especially now. Thank you, guys.
Wonderful, Etienne. Marlene, your last words.
Yes, so in March, we worked with Silent Saturday, that is part of Easter. Yesterday, we worked with Christ our King, which is the end of the church year. And I think the challenge is not only the second wave coming, but also the new liturgical year. And what I saw in the sermons is that each time in the church year, changes the preaching in it to some extent. I think that now more than ever is the time to preach Advent, to be in between spaces, to be awaiting for the King, not only the King to be born, but the King to come. And I think that when I love the idea of the pregnant woman and compassion fatigue, the fatigue that some women feel by the end of their pregnancy. It's not compassion fatigue, but there's this metaphorical link for me, not having been pregnant yet, so I speak out of a vast experience. But it's just the idea that if you have compassion fatigue and you preach in Advent about hope and joy, it's the reminder that Silent Saturday gives us, that hope and joy is not only resurrection, it is also suffering. And that's okay. You can also be sad in your hope and joy, if that makes sense. And then love and peace is not only fuzzy ideals, but it's anti-empire. And so you can be angry this Advent. So to embrace some of what we typically label as negative emotions that may accompany compassion fatigue, to embrace that, to use that as part of the message of hope of the coming King and the new life that we see in Christmas time.
Marilyn, all the preachers understood you very well. What a beautiful, beautiful foundation for Advent preaching this year. And Silent Night may be even a bit noisy this year, it sounds to me. Peter.
You talked about goal-directedness and that it becomes all the more important for resilience. What I've learned from congregations through the surveys and all the research projects during this time is that we are really seeing a goal in front of us post-COVID, and that is to engage in our communities. So my last word will be network. That was the word of the season of COVID. I think network, if you try to do it alone, it will not work. Engage in the community, in partnership with others, and let us get out there. And that will not tire us, that will break the fatigue.
Peter, wonderful. Don't touch but take hands, you're saying. I think it's extremely important. All that remains tonight is to do some thank yous. Firstly, Marijke, behind the scenes, thanks so much for the Zoom meeting, everything you've done. Etienne, Peter, Marilyn, this was for me personally extremely helpful, and I believe it was also for all the participants. I hope you all have a very, very blessed Advent time, a wonderful Christmas, in spite of all the challenges. And we will meet back here somewhere in the new year, early in the new year. Communitas will communicate the second and the third webinar. Baie dankie almal, julle moet lekker slaap. Thanks so much and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.